Hello friends! In this video, we will take apart some interesting and scary stories related to Craigslist. If you like the content, do not forget to rate the video and subscribe to the channel. This will help promote it on the site YouTube. Thank you. It was the summer of 2017 in Florida. A man named Michael decided to sell his smartphone through Craigslist. He posted an ad, and within a few hours, a potential buyer showed interest. They exchanged a few messages and agreed to meet at a nearby mall. Michael arrived at the meeting place, feeling a bit nervous but excited to make the sale. He saw a young woman sitting on a bench, looking at her phone. Michael walked over to her and introduced himself, and she confirmed that she was there to buy the phone. They negotiated the price, and the woman seemed pleased with the deal. As they were finalizing the transaction, Michael felt a sharp pain in his chest. He looked down and saw that the woman had pulled out a knife and stabbed him. Michael was shocked and tried to fight back, but the woman was too strong. She stabbed him several times in the body and then took the phone and fled, leaving Michael severely injured and bleeding on the ground. Several people who were passing by saw what had happened and called 911. Within minutes, the paramedics arrived and rushed Michael to the hospital. He was in critical condition and underwent emergency surgery to save his life. His family and friends were devastated by the news and prayed for his recovery. Meanwhile, the police were on the lookout for the woman who had attacked Michael. They reviewed the security footage from the mall and were able to identify her. She was caught a few days later and taken into custody. Her name was Sarah, and she was a young woman with a troubled past. Sarah had a history of drug abuse and had been in and out of jail several times. She had been desperate for money and had seen Michael's phone as an opportunity to make some quick cash. However, she had not planned on the violent attack and had acted impulsively. As the investigation continued, it was revealed that Sarah had been involved in several other crimes in the past. She had a long rap sheet and was known to be a dangerous criminal. A trial was set for the following year, and Michael was called to testify against her. The day of the trial arrived, and Michael was still recovering from his injuries. He was nervous, but determined to see justice served. He took the stand and told his story, reliving the terrifying experience of being attacked by Sarah. His testimony was powerful, and the jury was convinced of Sarah's guilt. Sarah was sentenced to 25 years in prison, and Michael was finally able to put the ordeal behind him. He had a long road to recovery ahead of him, but he was grateful to be alive and to have the support of his family and friends. Over the next few years, Michael worked hard to rebuild his life. He started a new job and met the love of his life, a woman named Emily. They fell in love and got married in 2021, 4 years after the attack. Looking back on the experience, Michael realized that it had changed him in many ways. He had learned to appreciate life more and to never take anything for granted. He had also become an advocate for victims of violent crime, speaking out about his experience and urging others to stay safe. In the end, Michael had emerged from the ordeal stronger and more determined than ever. He had overcome a traumatic experience and had found love and happiness in the process. The attack had been a dark chapter in his life, but had also taught him valuable lessons and had made him a better person. In 2016, in the bustling city of New York, a young woman named Sarah was preparing for an important business conference on trading and investing. As a budding trader, she knew that this conference would be a game changer for her career. Sarah had been trading in stocks and bonds for a few years, and she had recently started delving into the world of cryptocurrency. She wanted to learn as much as she could and network with other traders. However, Sarah had a problem. She needed a place to stay in New York for a couple of days, but hotels were too expensive. That's when she remembered the popular online marketplace, Craigslist. She browsed the website and found an affordable apartment for rent in a good location. The ad had detailed descriptions and pictures of the apartment. and it seemed perfect for her needs. Sarah quickly got in touch with the landlord, a man named John. They exchanged a few emails, and John agreed to rent the apartment to Sarah for the duration of her conference. They settled on a price, and Sarah transferred the money to John's account. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. The day of the conference arrived, and Sarah flew to New York. She took a cab from the airport to the address John had given her. As the cab pulled up to the apartment building, Sarah couldn't help but feel a little nervous. She had heard stories of people getting scammed on Craigslist, but she dismissed those thoughts as paranoia. Sarah entered the building and went up to the apartment. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She knocked again, but still no answer. Sarah started to worry. She took out her phone and dialed John's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Sarah left a message and decided to wait for a few more minutes. Suddenly, the door opened and a group of men rushed out. They were armed with guns and they grabbed Sarah, pulling her inside the apartment. Sarah screamed, but the men covered her mouth and dragged her to the living room. They demanded that she hand over all her valuables, including her wallet, phone, and laptop. Sarah complied, fearing for her life. As the men were ransacking the apartment, Sarah noticed a familiar name on one of the pieces of mail lying on the table. It was not John's name, but the name of the young man who had been brutally attacked in Texas the previous year. Sarah realized that she had fallen victim to the same group of robbers who had attacked the young man. The men took everything they could find and left Sarah alone in the apartment. She was terrified and shaken, but she managed to call the police. The police arrived quickly and took Sarah to the station. She gave them a detailed description of the robbers and the apartment, hoping that they would be caught and brought to justice. After investigating the case thoroughly, the police were able to identify and arrest the robbers. They were brought to trial, and the young man who had been attacked in Texas testified against them. The robbers were found guilty and sentenced to prison for a long time. Sarah was lucky to have survived the ordeal, but she learned a valuable lesson. She realized that she should always be cautious and vigilant when using online marketplaces. She also learned that the world of trading and investing could be dangerous, and she needed to be careful about who she associated with. Sarah continued to pursue her career as a trader, but she never forgot the terrifying experience she had in New York. In 2019, in the state of Illinois, a young woman named Emily decided to sell her furniture through Craigslist. She had recently moved to a new apartment and wanted to get rid of some of her old pieces. After posting an ad online, she received a message from a potential buyer who was interested in purchasing her items. Excited to make a sale, Emily agreed to meet the buyer in a parking lot near her apartment complex. She arrived at the meeting place, where a man was already waiting for her. They looked at the furniture and agreed on a price, but when Emily got out of the car to collect the money, the buyer suddenly pulled out a gun and threatened her. Emily was shocked and terrified, but she tried to remain calm and composed. She begged the man to take the money and leave her alone, but he refused to listen. Suddenly, the robber fired several shots at Emily, hitting her multiple times. She fell to the ground, bleeding and gasping for air. The man quickly grabbed the money and fled the scene, leaving Emily alone and helpless. Several witnesses heard the gunshots and called 911. An ambulance and police arrived shortly after, but it was too late. Emily had lost too much blood and was pronounced dead at the scene. The news of her tragic death shocked the community and left her family and friends devastated. The police launched an immediate investigation to catch the killer. They were able to identify the suspect through surveillance footage and witness testimony. The man was eventually caught and tried in court for the murder of Emily. During the trial, it was revealed that the robber had no intention of actually buying the furniture from Emily. He had planned to rob her from the very beginning and used the Craigslist ad as a way to lure her into a trap. However, his plan went awry when he panicked and shot Emily without even taking the money. The jury found the man guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that justice had been served, but it didn't bring Emily back or ease the pain of her loved ones. The tragic and senseless murder of Emily serves as a reminder of the dangers that can come with online transactions. It's important to take precautions when buying or selling items online, such as meeting in a public place and bringing a friend along for safety. Emily's death was a heartbreaking loss, but her memory will live on through the love and memories of those who knew and cherished her. In the year 2016, in a bustling New York, a young man named Jack was in dire need of a new phone. He decided to take his chances and search for one on Craigslist, an online marketplace where one can buy and sell all sorts of items. After some browsing, Jack came across a great deal on a brand new phone that caught his attention. He quickly contacted the seller and made an appointment to meet him in person to check out the phone. On the day of the meeting, Jack arrived at the agreed location, a deserted alleyway in the outskirts of the city. The seller was already there waiting for him. Jack took a closer look at the phone and noticed some defects that the seller hadn't mentioned before. Jack politely refused to buy the phone and turned to leave, but before he could take a step, the seller suddenly lunged at him. The seller, a burly man in his 30s, began to strangle Jack with his bare hands. Jack tried to fight back, but the seller was too strong. He was slowly losing consciousness. Jack was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, he didn't survive the attack. The news of Jack's death shook the city, and the police launched a massive investigation to find the perpetrator. They worked tirelessly day and night, collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses, until finally they were able to identify and apprehend the seller and his accomplices. The trial that followed was highly publicized, and the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see justice served. The evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelming, and the jury had no choice but to convict the perpetrators of murder, robbery, and assault. The judge handed down a sentence of life imprisonment without parole for the seller and his accomplices. The victim's family finally found some peace and closure, knowing that the perpetrators were behind bars and justice had been served. The tragic death of Jack was a harsh reminder of the dangers of online transactions and the importance of being vigilant when meeting strangers. The incident also sparked a nationwide conversation about the need for stronger regulations to protect online consumers. In the end, Jack's death was not in vain, as his story inspired many to be more cautious and mindful when using online marketplaces. His memory lived on as a testament to the importance of staying safe in the digital age. In the year 2020, in a small town in Oklahoma, a man named David was looking for someone to clean his home. He had been too busy with work and other obligations, and the mess had piled up. David didn't know anyone who could do the job, so he turned to Craigslist, hoping to find someone reliable and affordable. After a few days of searching, he found a man named Mark who had experience cleaning homes and had good reviews. David messaged Mark, and after a few back and forth messages, they agreed on a price and set a date for him to come over and clean. The day arrived, and Mark showed up on time. David showed him around the house, telling him what needed to be done. Mark seemed professional and got straight to work. David left to run some errands, expecting to come back to a clean house. But when David returned a few hours later, he was shocked by what he saw. The house was messier than when he had left it. He found Mark sitting on the couch, watching TV and drinking a beer. David was disappointed and angry, and he confronted Mark about the situation. Mark apologized and said he had been tired and needed a break. David agreed to give him some time to rest and went to his room to cool down. But a few minutes later, Mark approached David, demanding more money than they had agreed upon. David refused, telling Mark that they had made a deal and he couldn't just demand more money. But Mark didn't back down. He pulled out a gun from his pocket and pointed it at David. David froze, not knowing what to do. Mark pulled the trigger, and the sound of the gunshot echoed throughout the house. David fell to the ground, bleeding and gasping for air. Mark didn't seem to care and took the money from David's wallet before leaving the house. David died on the spot, leaving behind a shocked and grieving family. The news of the murder spread quickly throughout the town, and the police launched a massive manhunt for Mark. They combed through the town, searching for any clues that could lead them to him. They talked to witnesses and collected evidence, but Mark seemed to have disappeared into thin air. The town was on edge, and people were afraid to leave their homes. Parents kept their children close, and everyone was vigilant, watching out for any signs of danger. The weeks turned into months, and the search for Mark continued. The police were no closer to finding him. Then one day a tip came in. Someone had spotted a man who matched Mark's description in a nearby town. The police rushed to the scene, and after a brief chase, they apprehended him. Mark was brought to trial, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The town breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that justice had been served. But for David's family, the pain and grief never went away. They were left with a hole in their lives that could never be filled. They mourned David every day, and they never forgot the lesson that his tragic death taught them: to be careful and vigilant when dealing with strangers, even those who seem trustworthy. In the year 2017, in the sunny state of Florida, a young man named Ryan was living the American dream. He had started his own business, filming various business conferences for his clients, and was making a decent living out of it. Ryan was a happy-go-lucky person who loved to travel, explore new places, and capture them through his camera lens. He loved his camera more than anything else in the world. One day, Ryan decided to sell his camera as he was planning to upgrade to a newer model. He thought Craigslist would be the perfect platform to sell his beloved camera. He posted an advertisement, and within a few hours he received a call from a potential buyer who wanted to meet him in person. Ryan was excited to sell his camera and couldn't wait to meet the buyer. He reached the agreed-upon location, a secluded area near a park, and waited for the buyer to arrive. After a few minutes, he saw a car pull up, and a man stepped out of the car. The man approached Ryan, and they exchanged pleasantries. The buyer then asked Ryan to show him the camera. Ryan handed him the camera, and the buyer inspected it closely. After a few minutes, the buyer told Ryan that he didn't have the money to pay for the camera, but had something else in mind. Ryan was taken aback and confused about what the buyer was trying to say. Before he could react, the buyer pulled out a gun and pointed it at Ryan. Ryan was terrified and couldn't believe what was happening. He begged the buyer to spare his life and take the camera. However, the buyer was not interested in the camera anymore. He demanded that Ryan hand over his wallet and other belongings. Ryan complied and handed over everything he had. The buyer was still not satisfied and wanted to make sure that Ryan couldn't follow him. He aimed his gun at Ryan's leg and pulled the trigger. Ryan fell to the ground, screaming in agony as the bullet penetrated his flesh. The buyer quickly grabbed the camera and ran away, leaving Ryan lying on the ground, bleeding profusely. Ryan somehow managed to drag himself to the nearby road, where a passerby found him and called an ambulance. Ryan was rushed to the hospital, and doctors worked tirelessly to save his life. The bullet had damaged his leg muscles severely, and Ryan was left with a limp for the rest of his life. However, Ryan was lucky to have survived the ordeal. The buyer was later caught by the police and was sentenced to life in prison for his heinous crime. Ryan's life changed after the incident. He lost his passion for photography and started living in fear. He couldn't trust anyone and became paranoid about his safety. He never fully recovered from the trauma and continued to suffer from nightmares and flashbacks. Ryan's business suffered, and he eventually had to shut it down as he couldn't continue to work in the same field. Ryan's story is a stark reminder of the dangers of online transactions and the need to exercise caution when dealing with strangers. It also highlights the importance of taking the necessary precautions to protect oneself from potential harm. In 2015, in a quiet Ohio town, a young woman named Sarah was about to throw a big party for her friends and neighbors. Anticipating the event, she decided to hire someone to clean her and her neighbor's house. She turned to Craigslist to find someone who could help her with the job. After looking through several ads, she finally found a man named Jake who had years of cleaning experience and promised to do a great job. Sarah was relieved to find someone who could help her and immediately hired Jake for the job. They arranged for him to come to her on Saturday afternoon. On the day of the job, Jake quickly arrived at Sarah's house. He seemed a friendly and reliable man, and Sarah felt at ease with him. She showed him around the house and explained what needed to be cleaned. He seemed to do his job well and made small talk with Sarah as he worked. However, the day went on, and Sarah's neighbors began to arrive at the party. As the music and laughter grew louder, Jake seemed to become agitated and restless. Sarah noticed that he was looking at her strangely and anxiously. Suddenly, when no one was looking, Jake attacked Sarah. He brutally beat her and then committed violent acts on her. He left her lying on the floor, helpless and alone. After he left, Sarah managed to run to the phone and call the police. The police arrived quickly and Sarah was taken to the hospital for medical attention. She was severely injured and traumatized by the attack. The police began a manhunt for Jake, but he fled the scene, leaving no trace behind. Within months, Jake remained at large, and Sarah's life was turned upside down. She found it difficult to sleep, eat, and go about her daily activities. The trauma of the attack left her in a state of constant fear and anxiety. Finally, after months of searching, the police managed to track down Jake. They discovered that he had escaped to a neighboring state and was living under a false identity. With the help of local law enforcement, they were able to apprehend him and bring him to justice. Jake went to trial and was found guilty of assault and battery. He was sentenced to life in prison, and Sarah was finally able to move on with her life after her traumatic experience. This incident shook a small town in Ohio and brought to public attention the dangers of hiring strangers through online platforms. Sarah's story became a warning to others, and people became more vigilant about who they let into their home. In the end, Sarah's strength and resilience helped her overcome her trauma and begin a new chapter in her life. She became an advocate for victims of abuse and worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the issue. Her story has been an inspiration to many, and she has become a beacon of hope to those who have experienced similar tragedy. In the year 2016, in a small town in Alabama, a young man named Michael was in the market for a new cell phone. He had been browsing the Craigslist website and had finally found a good deal. The seller, a man named John, had agreed to meet Michael at a local park to make the transaction. On the day of the meeting, Michael arrived at the park and spotted John sitting on a bench, looking at his phone. Michael approached him, introduced himself, and they began to discuss the phone. John seemed friendly enough, and the two struck up a conversation. However, things quickly took a dark turn. As they were discussing the phone, John suddenly pulled out a gun and pointed it at Michael, demanding that he hand over all his money and valuables. Michael was caught off guard and didn't know what to do. He was frozen with fear, but he knew he couldn't just give up without a fight. Suddenly, Michael made a decision that would change his life forever. He decided to fight back. Without hesitation, Michael reached for his own gun, which he always carried with him for self-defense, and fired at John. The two men engaged in a fierce shootout, with bullets flying in all directions. Both were hit, and they fell to the ground, bleeding profusely. After a few minutes, the shooting stopped, and the park fell silent. Michael lay on the ground, his heart racing, wondering if he had made the right decision. He looked over at John, who was lying motionless, and realized that he had killed the man. Michael was in shock, and he knew his life would never be the same again. The police arrived on the scene a few minutes later, and Michael was taken to the hospital for treatment. He was later released, but he was haunted by the memory of what had happened. He wondered if he could have done things differently, if he could have avoided the shooting altogether. But in his heart, he knew that he had acted in self-defense, and that he had done what he had to do to survive. The community was divided in their opinions about what had happened. Some people praised Michael for his bravery, while others criticized him for carrying a gun and for taking matters into his own hands. There were even some who believed that John had been justified in trying to rob Michael, given the difficult circumstances he was in. Despite the controversy, Michael continued to live his life as best he could. He tried to put the shooting behind him, but it was always there, lingering in the back of his mind. He never forgot what had happened, and he knew that he would carry the weight of that day with him for the rest of his life. In the end, the shooting served as a reminder of the dangers that lurk around every corner, and the importance of being prepared for the unexpected. Michael learned that life can change in an instant, and that we must always be ready to defend ourselves and our loved ones. The shooting may have been a tragedy, but it also taught Michael an important lesson about the value of life and the importance of staying safe. In 2018, in the quiet town of Naperville, Illinois, a young man by the name of Alex had decided to sell his beloved guitar. It was a decision he had not come to lightly, as the instrument had been with him through thick and thin for years. However, he needed the money and decided to sell it through Craigslist. After a few inquiries, Alex found a potential buyer and arranged to meet him at a nearby park. The buyer arrived promptly and introduced himself as Mike. Alex handed him the guitar and watched as Mike strummed a few chords, seemingly pleased with the sound. Suddenly, and without warning, Mike lunged at Alex with a knife. Alex was caught off guard, but managed to dodge the first few strikes. A struggle ensued, and in the chaos, Alex was stabbed multiple times. Desperately wounded and losing consciousness, Alex was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. The doctors did all they could, but the wounds were too severe, and Alex passed away. The police immediately launched an investigation into the brutal attack and quickly identified the suspect, Mike, through the Craigslist messages exchanged between him and Alex. With the evidence gathered, Mike was arrested and charged with murder. During the trial, it was revealed that Mike had a history of mental illness and had been off his medication for several months leading up to the attack. The defense argued that he was not in his right state of mind and pleaded for a lighter sentence. However, the prosecution argued that Mike's mental illness did not excuse his actions and that he was still fully responsible for the heinous crime he had committed. After several days of deliberation, the jury found Mike guilty and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The news of Alex's death sent shockwaves through the community, and many were left wondering how such a senseless tragedy could happen. It was a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked on the internet, and how easily something as innocent as selling a guitar could turn deadly. Alex's family and friends were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, forever haunted by the memory of his tragic death. The guitar, once a source of joy and inspiration, now stood as a painful reminder of what had happened. In the end, justice was served, but the scars of the tragedy would remain forever. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of life, and how quickly everything could be taken away. In the year 2014, in the bustling city of Kansas, a young man named Jack decided to sell his beloved motorcycle through Craigslist. It was a tough decision for him, as he had invested a lot of time and money into it, but he needed the cash urgently. After posting the advertisement online, he received a message from a potential buyer who seemed interested in purchasing the bike. They agreed to meet in a secluded area outside the city, away from prying eyes. On the day of the meeting, Jack arrived at the location on time, feeling a little apprehensive but hopeful. The buyer, a tall man with a shaved head, was waiting for him. They exchanged greetings and Jack showed him the motorcycle. The buyer seemed satisfied and asked Jack to give him a test ride. Jack hesitated at first, but the man insisted, saying that he needed to be sure that the bike was in good condition. As soon as Jack handed over the keys, he realized that something was off about the buyer. He seemed nervous and edgy, and his eyes darted around suspiciously. Jack tried to shake off the feeling and waited patiently for him to return. However, after a few minutes, he heard the sound of the engine fading away into the distance. Panic set in as Jack realized that he had been duped. He had been robbed, and the thief had taken off with his motorcycle. Just as he was about to dial the police, he felt a cold metal object pressing against his temple. He turned around to see the buyer pointing a gun at him, a menacing grin on his face. The next few moments were a blur. The thief demanded that Jack hand over all the money he had on him. When Jack protested, he received a brutal blow to the head, and everything went black. When he woke up, he found himself lying in a hospital bed with a throbbing pain in his left hand. It was then that he realized that one of his fingers was missing. The doctors told him that he had been brought in by a good Samaritan who had found him lying on the side of the road, bleeding profusely. Jack couldn't believe his luck. He had survived a terrible ordeal, but he had lost one of his fingers. He felt a deep sense of anger and frustration at the thief who had ruined his life. Over the next few weeks, Jack went through a long and painful recovery process. He had to undergo surgery to repair the damage done to his hand, and he was left with a large scar where his finger used to be. However, he was determined to seek justice and bring his attacker to book. The police investigation led to the arrest of the gang member who had robbed Jack. He was tried in court and found guilty of robbery and assault. Jack was relieved to see the thief being brought to justice, but he couldn't shake off the trauma of the incident. As time went by, Jack found solace in his family and friends who rallied around him and helped him through his darkest moments. He also discovered a newfound passion for helping victims of crime and joined a local organization that provided support to people who had been through similar experiences. In the end, Jack emerged stronger and wiser, a testament to the indomitable human spirit. His story inspired countless others to overcome their own challenges and find hope in the face of adversity. But he will never forget the pain and suffering he endured. In 2020, in the bustling city of Miami, Florida, a man named Jack was trying to sell his beloved car. Jack bought the car with his hard-earned money and went to great lengths to keep it in pristine condition. However, due to unforeseen circumstances, Jack was forced to sell it. He decided to place an ad on Craigslist and wait for a potential buyer. A few days passed and Jack began to receive responses from interested buyers. However, one particular buyer caught his attention. The buyer, whose name was John, was willing to pay Jack the asking price without any haggling. Jack was delighted and arranged to meet John in person. On the day of the meeting, Jack drove his car to the designated location and waited for John. After a few minutes, a man approached Jack and introduced himself as John. Jack showed him the car, and John seemed impressed. But John abruptly refused to buy it and left the meeting place. The next day, upon arriving at the spot where he had parked the car, Jack was shocked to see that it was gone. Jack immediately went to the police and informed them of the theft. The police promised to investigate and find the culprit. Days turned into weeks, and still nothing was known about Jack's car. Jack became worried and decided to take matters into his own hands. He started looking for his car on his own, and after a few days, he received a report that his car had been spotted on the other side of town. Jack immediately got into his other car and began to pursue the thief. Jack's chase, however, was short-lived. In his rush to catch the thief, Jack lost control of his car and crashed into a tree. The impact was so severe that Jack did not survive the accident. His family and friends were shaken by the news, and the police were left with an unsolved case. Meanwhile, the thief who stole Jack's car was finally caught by the police. He had tried to sell the car to an unsuspecting customer, but was caught thanks to a tip from a vigilant citizen. The thief was apprehended, and he confessed to stealing Jack's car. The news of Jack's tragic death and the thief's subsequent arrest spread through the city like wildfire. People were shocked and saddened by this turn of events. The incident served as a warning to anyone who planned to sell their cars through online platforms. He also stressed the importance of vigilance and caution when dealing with strangers. My opinion: reading these stories makes you reluctantly put yourself in the place of the victims, and it's certainly very scary. I think that many people could have avoided it if they had just called a few friends with them, or if they had taken pepper spray with them, for example. Fortunately, many managed to survive the attack. By the way, also glad that passers-by quickly provided help and called ambulances and police did not pass by. Thank you for watching.